Okay, we're starting the panel. I think that probably some of you sitting there have some questions. But before we give you the opportunity to ask some questions, I would like to ask our two remaining panel participants. Actually, I would like to say something first. I appreciated very much the last words that we received about Italy, because it has been my impression, and I've known Italian economists and especially pension economists now for 20 years. And the problem with the otherwise very excellent reforms that came from the beginning of the 1990s in Italy were never communicated to the people. And it is a major mistake, because the people did not know, they had not heard the narrative of why they had this new pension scheme. It took until 2012 when Elsa Fornero in Italy, I think, emphasized what it was. But this is always a good message to learn from, that you have to have a narrative. You have to communicate why you're doing what you're doing and to get people on board. If you can't do that, then you probably shouldn't be doing it. Okay, I want to start by asking our two remaining panelists what you think is the most important message. You can have a couple of minutes each. The most important message to leave for Lithuania before you take the flight out. Given all of this, together you have lots of international experience looking at the European Union and looking at the OECD countries. There's a lot to learn. So what are the major messages? We can start with Europe.
Okay. Thank you. So first, I mean, Lithuania has taken very serious steps to improve the pension system. There was the review of the law in 2016, which brought about, if I'm correctly informed, for the first time set out a proper indexation regime, because I think in the past it was something that was done conventionally, ad hoc. So this is something then that does not provide for stability over time. So putting up clear rules is very important. I mentioned briefly in my intervention that there is some unclarity on how in the future the current law would work. So I think it would be beneficial to clarify under which circumstances different type of indexation regimes would be used, because not only does it have an effect on the government finances, but of course it also will have an effect on the future pension levels for people. So you need, it's good policy to clarify this. Last point for Lithuania is, I mean, I'll just recall a general recommendation that the European Commission issued now in the 2018 cycle of the European semester. And it essentially is a three-pronged approach, that is to support longer working careers. And this then includes a side of labor market policies that should flank inclusiveness in the labor market in general. It also includes considering the possibility of linking retirement age or contributory periods to life expectancy to take account of the slow-moving but largely known changes in the demographic structure, instead of having to resort to do these reoccurring and often very challenging discussions in Parliament. You put some automaticity into the system. That's something that you don't have for the moment, but it's something that you could consider. And as a matter of fact, on this first prong, currently about half of the EU countries have such mechanisms in place. Many of them are operating on the retirement age, so include longevity concerns into the retirement age. Several of them also include it linked to the size of the pension benefit. Of course, both can work. If you operate through the pension benefit, it gives incentives to people to prolong their working career because they can adjust their future pension levels. The crux is, as we have heard from Professor Palmer and also from OECD colleagues, there is the extent to which people might be myopic. So then the incentives doesn't really bite. That's why then a link of the retirement age to life expectancy is, to say the least, strong incentive. You're simply not eligible. So that works well. We're also covering the aspect of early retirement. And here, what I'm talking about is undue early exit from the labor force. Need to take measures to avoid abuse of such behaviors in countries. I'm fully aware that there are many people who are not able to work up until a high age. And if you link retirement age to life expectancy, for some persons this will be too high an age, which is why you cannot have one single pension scheme. You need to allow for different exits depending on personal capacities. So this is something that needs to be there. But this should not be the norm. The norm should be one of a dynamic system. Secondly, and very importantly, is that we are proposing, as we heard from the colleague of the EIOPA today, we are promoting strongly complementary retirement incomes. So that's non-public retirement incomes. As I've showed you earlier on, at the overall level, at the abstract EU level, there is a stabilization of public pension spending to GDP. So this means that there is no need for further tax increase or social security increases over the long term. This never happened in the EU. It happened for the first time when we completed this report. Something has to give. What has to give is that there is an adaptation of the benefit ratios, meaning that there is a clear scope for additional complementary private retirement savings. And I think that's something also where Lithuania is a very good example for the moment. This already exists. It's in place. Coverage is not great yet because it's being built up, the second pillars, but this is the way to do it. I'd say, and I depart now from the European Commission perspective, that it might also be a good idea to have an element of private pensions because, after all, there are people who will draw the pension. And if there are some parts of the pension provision that they are in charge of, they can track the returns, they can choose the funds. This can enhance the awareness of what you do matters for your own personal incomes. You should, of course, also have transparent track records of your public pillar pensions, but it's very important to include the element of private pensions. Thank you.
Thank you. So I would have, I think, 3 messages which are most important and were raised, I think, more or less so far. One is this, that it really seems that rising retirement age is crucial to sustain high enough pensions in a way that it does not undermine public finances. And this is easier to implement upfront than that's in the phase of crisis. So it seems that, I would strongly encourage the links of retirement age to life expectancy in the future after 2026, which then would make the Lithuanian pension system even stronger and better to some extent. Then there is a question. There was the very first presentation. There was a question raised about general redistribution in the Lithuanian public finances general, so that inequalities in Lithuania are quite high compared to other countries, and then the taxes are not progressive enough. So from this perspective, it's also important to see that if there is a sort of change of the view, that there is some possibility to increase redistribution or increase the redistribution of the public finance or tax in general. It can be also mirrored to some extent in the pension system, which means that the basic pension scheme would be is the most important part that can supply pensions for those who cannot work, who leave labor market, and to some extent cannot work that long. And this basic pension scheme will increase in the future. Its importance, it seems so. So it's also important to make it transparent. Maybe provide some linkages of the benefit level to the average wage or the wage bill, because it happened in many countries, like Sweden, like Latvia, that when these benefits are not linked to anything, then they can deteriorate quite fast in many countries, making making the vulnerable groups very in the even worse position, because then it's much easier not to increase the benefits, and then those who are worse off are even worse. So this basic pension scheme is also important, and it should not be put aside. And then it seems that this move that is taking place very slowly in Lithuania, like very slowly because of the demographics they are working, so making them the private DC schemes mandatory for early people, and somehow they are going to some extent substitute the public scheme that is now in place. I think it is very important to think about the upfront and at present about designing this first the regulation, how it operates to bring the pensioners the highest possible returns, and then to think about this payout phase, not to leave it just that people have saved, so we are giving them money and then let it happen, because then it quite often end up that very old people end up with no means of living or very low means of living and have to rely on safety nets. So this very precise and well thought development of and design of the payout phase of the DC scheme is also very important, should be also becoming more and more important in the focus of the policy discussions.
Thank you very much. Now we have 8 minutes for questions from the audience. Please, okay, we have one person, very quick.
My name is Marijus Kalesinskas. I represent the Association of Pension Fund Members. That means the people saving in the pension funds of the second and third pillar. Pretty much it makes Association of Future Pensioners. Well, currently I wanted to address one issue that we discuss in our association. That is actually an issue of governance in the pension funds that we have. We see that as a flaw of the design of our current three-pillar pension system promoted by the World Bank that we have in place. Where in the second pillar and also in the third pillar, we have funds that are managed by the investment managers. But the pension fund members, the savers, they have virtually no say in how it is done. And very little of control, apart from walking away from the funds that they do not like, which is not actually very much happening because the typical savers in the pension funds, they are quite passive. So, and otherwise, other than walking away from the fund, they do not have any instrument to influence the operation of the fund and management of the fund. And well, drawing on your experience and your knowledge of seeing various systems and various designs, maybe you can provide any suggestion how to fix that flaw, basically, how to allow the access for the pension fund members to participate in some of the decisions, or at least the most important decisions, how the investment policies are formed, how the investment managers are chosen, and so on. Thank you.
Okay. Maybe we could take a couple of questions before we start to try to answer. Maybe one more question or two more questions. There's one.
Simonas Krepšta, Bank of Lithuania. We had a reform adopted this summer, and it will start from the next year, beginning of next year. And my question would be, what would be your advice on the key elements to have this reform successful? Our reform is mainly on strengthening the second pillar and to having enough people, more people involved in private saving, and also at the adequate level. So what would be your advice how to get the practical implementation as successful as possible?
One more question. Everyone is so satisfied? All right, we can answer these two questions, and then we can see if there arise any other questions. I might just try to tackle the first question a little. I understand what you're saying, and it's very important. And I come from a country where there is considerable transparency in what's happening at the level of the funded pension savings, which we have in all different manners. There's a mandatory public. There is the occupational schemes, which are quasi-mandatory because you're in them if you've got that occupation, and then there are also even private schemes, which actually are not so popular in Sweden either, I should say. But the first two, everybody's got a part of, and I think that there are two answers to the question. One is to make everything very transparent. That is to say that the participants know what's happening with their money, so that there's good advertising, and I would even suggest perhaps developing something that you might call a clearinghouse for everything that makes sure that everything is transparent, that the money which is invested, you can see where the funds are being put. You can see how many participants there are. You can see if there are 2 or 3 or 5 funds. You can see how they're investing their money. You can see information about their strategies and everything that could be relevant in order to understand what's happening. Because otherwise, of course, people can't understand, and it decreases their interest considerably in what's happening. So let them know what's happening, make it a big thing. Then what happens is that it even gets discussed sometimes in the newspapers, because the news is transparent for the financial journalists to write about maybe once a year when they see that what the funds are doing with their money, and they see that some are more successful than others. But among the most important thing is transparency and making the information available. And then you might even ask the question, is there some way to have a representation of the participants? And an indirect way to do it is to make sure that you've got all of this information and discussion going on in society, which means that people sitting in this audience are well informed, can partake in that discussion also, but journalists, etc. And then I think your question is relevant, and the process of doing it has probably something to do with the board of directors of the funds, and then you have to think about how do you want to constitute the board of directors. You give them the responsibility to represent, of course, the participants, and you make sure that the persons who are there are doing a good job of it. That was a long answer, I'm sorry. You both can answer the other question, or even this question if you want to.
Okay, so on how practically to strengthen the second pillar, I think how to ensure good enrollment in non-public schemes. Non-public schemes is not difficult to get high coverage in. You have it. So it's the second pillar. I mean, there are good experiences in the UK where they have what is called the nest pension, and how they get people to actually how they get good coverage is that it's called auto enrollment, and they have default options, so it's easy to get in. You need to take active choices how to get out of the schemes. And experience has shown, research has shown also in other regions in Australia, that if you have auto enrollment, you have a very good chance of continuing coverage. Professor Palme already brought out the thing with transparency. That, of course, is very important. You need to know what are the rules governing, what are the possibilities for changing. I think something, but you can correct me there if I don't remember exactly how it was in Sweden. I think you are allowed to do a couple of reviews of your investment portfolio choices, but you can't do like one every week. throughout the year. You can only do like a select few because of there were some problems initially that people were jumping around from the funds all the time, and that also came at a cost. So there's also put some order in how to review your asset allocation strategy.
Okay, that was a question for me then. The answer is that initially it was possible to switch as much and as often as you wanted to. This was in the mandatory public scheme. And then, of course, there are different rules for the occupational schemes. And they can be different for the different occupational schemes too. But the problem that Sweden had with the being able to switch all the time as much as you wanted to, which I could just turn mine on my computer and order a switch, which is very nice, and I did it. But what happened we started charging for the switches. Yeah, because everybody has a bank in Sweden, and even you see some of the same banks in this country and in other countries, the Swedish banks, and they make it. They somehow get into these investment change discussions because they provide personal advice on everything, including, of course, by the way, are you in Swedbank's participation because Swedbank offers about 30 or 40 funds in the public system, which you can choose, and then it can also be a participant in some of the occupational schemes. But there's nothing wrong with that, of course. But other than that Swedbank could order about a few thousand switches in a day because they somehow organized this, and so that this created a lot of trouble for the electronic switching system, and it was so that's more or less what it was. But in essence, I can still switch anytime I want to, and yeah. So that we can continue. So it's not as.
So what I understand also, I would like to add to the questions, there are two types of switches, so that the choices people can make within the private schemes, mandatory schemes. One is they can switch providers, so jump from one institution to the other, from one bank to the other insurer company, and it is supposed to increase the competition across companies, because if one gets low returns, then people would switch the others. In theory, it should increase the efficiency of them and provide efficient market solutions. Unfortunately, there are some examples of countries that it's not enough. It might not be enough to rely on competition in that sense. So yes, it is to some extent. It is nothing wrong in allowing switches, but we should be careful and aware that it might not be enough to ensure the competition across companies. So some regulations in terms of the top of the total costs that they can incur. They are almost everywhere. Such regulations are there, and some limits to the cost that financial institution can charge. It's always there, and it seems that when they are lowered, companies manage to adjust. Then there is another choice that people can make, so they can switch between different, let's say, sort of plans within an insurer or a company. So they can go for more aggressive investment or less aggressive investment, which should reflect their attitude toward risks and their age and so on. And what here is quite important, and it is also sort of a Swedish experience, that if you have too much choice, to some extent that it's hard for people to make a choice out of 200 or a few hundred possibilities. So these choices should be somehow limited to a few options. This is what behavioral economics says us, that in theory people can choose between anything, but in practice it's not easy for people, and they don't spend so much time to choose and really analyze hundreds of options. But then it seems important to have also good default strategies and default options, because in most countries, most people stick to what they are subscribed by automatically. So the default options are important, and we heard that it is a part of the changes that are taking place in Lithuania is that to introduce the life cycle approach as a default option, so that the risk, so that plans are adjusted for risk for all the people. So with age, at the younger ages, you are in a more aggressive funds. When you are becoming closer to retirement, the funds are becoming less aggressive and mainly in bonds, which is something that OECD in fact recommends, to have this life cycle plans and to put it as a default option.
Okay, just a quick comment on my own. We're out of time, but of course I need to say something. So in Sweden, actually, there are 800 funds in the public scheme, mandatory scheme, that are registered as operators in this scheme. But I think, in a sense, the good news is that somewhere around 60%, and it's growing, are in the default fund. The people are choosing the default fund, and it's actually been possible now to choose the default fund if you want to. And the default fund actually has the best return record of it. It's higher than the average of all of the whole country of Sweden's average choices. But the interesting thing is that most people and their independent choices choose world market funds. And so that the world market funds, if you take a look at what dominates, it's that kind of a fund, and it's also the default fund invests its money in the world market actively, not but as a world market fund. And it has this has also this life cycle saving thing, which is very important. Okay, I think that we are at the end of our day, and we want to, not of our day, but at least the end of this panel. And so we want to thank the audience for the couple of questions that we got, and I think for me this has been a very interesting and productive day. I hope it has for you too. Thank you very much.